On Friday, the nation lost a monumental figure, someone who made huge personal sacrifices to help our nation move past the sin of racism and align more with the principles of our founding. John Lewis had secured his place among the giants of American history before his career in Congress had even begun. From a sharecropper's farm with no electricity or running water, John Lewis rose to share the stage with Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. as a founding leader of the mid-century civil rights movement. His unwavering example of nonviolent resistance became a powerful rallying cry, swelling the ranks of marches and sit-ins and commanding the attention of the nation. As a young student, John demonstrated wisdom beyond his years and unimaginable patience and dignity in the face of harassment and brutal assaults from the champions of segregation. From boycotts and sit-ins to Bloody Sunday in Selma, he suffered and suffered and suffered. But he kept working. He was unshaken in the belief that our nation could do better, and he was willing to pay for that progress with his own blood. The cause of justice called John Lewis to the vanguard, from organizing the lunch counter sit-ins that made Nashville the first southern city to begin desegregating public places, to leading the first historic freedom riders across the South, to chairing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that helped mobilize a generation, to addressing the March on Washington from the Lincoln Memorial. By the time he turned 25, John had already lent his voice and his body to a full lifetime's work. But he wasn't finished yet. That same spirit of urgency followed him here to Washington. Whether the day's issues found you on his side of a policy debate or on the opposite side, his warmth, friendliness, and dedication to his neighbors in Georgia's 5th District made an impact on everyone. I'm reminded particularly of joining hands with him at a ceremony here in the Capitol honoring his friend Dr. King in 2008. As members of Congress sang "We Shall Overcome," it was humbling to reflect on what the man standing next to me had suffered and sacrificed so that those words could be sung at such an occasion in that place. So, Mr. President, the memory of our colleague brings to mind Dr. King's own words. He famously said, quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, and it bends toward justice." It would be a mistake to read those words and assume that he meant this bending is inevitable. Our society has only marched toward justice because great figures like Congressman John Lewis took it upon themselves to lead the way. So the nation mourns his passing. The nation mourns his passing, and we celebrate the life of this American hero. Now, on an entirely different matter, it's been half a year since the deadly coronavirus began to spread from China throughout the world. 3.7 million cases have been recorded on American soil. More than 140,000 lives have been lost. Today, our nation stands at a challenging crossroads. States and localities are trying to balance the need to reopen and foster economic recovery with the need to stay on offense against the virus. Back in March, the American people began a period of historic disruption and heroic sacrifice in order to stunt the spread of the virus. Life as we'd known it was simply put on ice. Daily routines were reinvented, not as a permanent solution, but as a short-term emergency measure to save our healthcare system. The American people stepped up. The sacrifices saved lives. Nowhere in the United States did hospitals suffer the fate of the medical system in places like Italy. Our nation met new kinds of American heroes, doctors and nurses who worked double shifts, washed their hands raw, and endured physical separation from their loved ones so they could continue to treat ours. Essential maintenance, delivery, and grocery store workers who kept clocking in to keep families, communities, and entire industries supplied and functioning. Teachers and parents who tried their best to keep school in session for our nation's children from virtual classrooms and kitchen tables all across our country. No generation before us had ever had to pull the emergency brake on national life in quite this way. And this historic challenge required historic support. So the Senate wrote and passed the largest rescue package in history. The CARES Act put financial assistance in the pockets of American families. It sent hundreds of billions of dollars so that employers could keep paying workers. It mobilized unprecedented resources for the medical response. Economists and experts across the spectrum agreed that the Senate's bold bipartisan policies have made a tremendous difference these past months. So, Mr. President, the question before the Senate this week is, where are we now? Where are we now? On the one hand, our healthcare fight against the virus itself is very obviously unfinished. New spikes in large and economically central states show that we are nowhere near out of the woods. At the same time, neither economics nor our nation's sanity would sustain an indefinite total lockdown until there's a vaccine. So even as we continue to fight the healthcare battle, cautious reopenings will need to proceed in ways that are as smart, safe, and data-driven as possible. This is the situation facing the Senate as we discuss and consider the possibility of another recovery package. It would neither be another multi-trillion-dollar bridge loan to make up for a totally shut down economy, nor an ordinary stimulus for a nation ready to get back to normal. The need now lies somewhere in between. We need to continue supporting our healthcare system and harbor no delusion that this virus is behind us, because it isn't, while also taking strategic steps to help laid-off American workers get rehired and American families get their kids back in school this fall. That is why Senate Republicans will be putting forward a strong starting point for additional recovery legislation, hopefully as soon as this week. It will take a good faith bipartisan cooperation from our Democratic colleagues to actually make a law. That productive spirit is what got the CARES Act across the finish line unanimously. But last month, that spirit was absent. A political determination from our Democratic colleagues led them to block the Justice Act and block the Senate from even turning to the subject of police reform, even as millions had taken to the streets demanding change. So, for the sake of our nation, if we want to continue helping the American people, the next several weeks will need to look a lot more like March and a lot less like June. Senate Republicans will put forward our proposal soon. I hope our Democratic colleagues will be ready to work together to get an outcome. But first, Mr. President, this week the Senate will complete two other important pieces of the people's business. First, we'll confirm the President's choice to head the Office of Management and Budget. Then we'll finish and pass the annual National Defense Authorization Act for a 60th consecutive time. As COVID-19 captured our nation's attention, we knew our adversaries around the world would not ease up. We knew that those who seek to harm America, our interests, and our allies would use the commotion to show even more of their true colors. And sure enough, the Russian military has flirted even closer to the boundaries of U.S. airspace. Iran has stepped up its meddling in regional conflicts. China has escalated both its international bullying and its domestic repression, such as in Hong Kong. So I'm particularly encouraged that Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reid, and our committee colleagues have put forward a robust, bipartisan bill. It will invest in the training and technology that will keep our fighting forces on the cutting edge. It will strengthen our alliances and partnerships with shared systems for containing threats. It will honor our service members and their families with the pay raises and top-notch services they deserve here at home. That means new investments in 5G systems and hypersonic weapons, the establishment of European and Pacific defense initiatives for greater cooperation to check Russia and China, and improving military family housing, education, and health care. The NDAA will build on the success of the last 3 years in rebuilding and modernizing the world's greatest fighting forces. It will continue to advance our new national defense strategy, putting aside the naive resets of the past administration and continuing to invest in strength instead. So I'll be proud to vote to advance and pass the NDAA, and I'd hope all of our colleagues will join me.
On Friday, July 17th, after 6 decades, as one of our nation's most preeminent civil rights leaders, Congressman John Lewis, the conscience of the Congress, passed away at the age of 80. His trials and tribulations, and ultimately his triumphs, are well known to all of us. At the ripe old age of 25, he led thousands of marchers across a bridge in Alabama, risking their lives for their constitutionally guaranteed right to vote, and in doing so, shook the conscience of the nation and hastened the demise of Jim Crow. On that fateful Sunday, battered and bruised, his head dizzy and bleeding from the policeman's rod, John Lewis found the courage and strength to reach the other side of the bridge, and he never stopped marching. From the Freedom Rides to Selma, from his leadership of the SNCC to his 4 decades in Congress, John Lewis never stopped marching. His actions as a young man helped change the trajectory of a nation and brought about the Voting Rights Act. And then John Lewis went to Congress and renewed that law again and again. He sat in against segregation at lunch counters in the Jim Crow South, and over 40 years later led another sit-in on the House floor against gun violence. He spoke out for marriage equality long before it was popular. He challenged those who walked the corridors of power and then trod those corridors himself to bring quality health care, fair wages, and social justice to Georgians and Americans everywhere. It is one thing, inflamed with the passion of youth, to join in brave endeavors and challenge the status quo, and it's a good thing. But it's even beyond that to sustain that activism and vision and efforts, and yes, that good trouble he talked about getting into over the steady and persistent dedication of a lifetime. But that's who John Lewis was deep in his soul, a man on a mission who forcefully but gently led us all to do more and do better, who loved his country so much that he risked his life and then spent his life trying to change it. We're an imperfect nation for sure, but we have a tremendous ability to reinvent ourselves. The story of America is one of constant renewal, but that renewal has never been preordained. It is because Americans have pushed and prodded, used their voices and their votes to force our country to change over time, move ever closer to our highest ideals. In the story of America, there are certain heroes whose moral clarity shone out like a beacon for others to follow. North Stars, who have inspired their fellow Americans to join them in the glorious work of bending the moral arc of the universe towards justice. John Lewis was one of those special heroes. He paved the road, lit the path, pointed the way towards other bridges for us to cross. It wasn't by always being the loudest voice or the most intemperate. He led by the moral force of his example. Whether he would admit it or not, he inspired millions. At President Obama's inauguration, John asked the new president to sign a commemorative photo of the event. President Obama simply wrote, "Because of you, John." I don't know how many people must have said that over the years. Because of you, John. And I never could guess the number who didn't even know to say it, but whose lives were forever altered, whose dignity and freedom was made whole because of you, John. As a new generation of young people lift up their voice to proclaim Black Lives Matter, to fight for the Justice in Policing Act, the memory and legacy of John Lewis lives on in each and every one of them. There are very few people who have changed the world for the better. John Lewis is one of them. His life is a reminder of all that's the best in us, and that we are all capable of doing that best. As we mourn his loss, I'd ask my fellow Americans, including my colleagues in this body, to take up his mission. Many of the old enemies John faced down have not been vanquished. Racial disparities persist and gnaw at the fabric of our society. So does the police violence that met a young John Lewis and thousands of law-abiding Americans on that bridge over 50 years ago. The bridge he crossed is still named for the Confederate officer and not for the man who led the righteous movement for equality. The law he nearly died for has been gutted by the Supreme Court. Congress has the power to restore it, but only one political party seems interested in doing so. At the 50th anniversary of the March on Selma, Congressman Lewis acknowledged that his mission was not yet complete. There is still work left to be done, he said. We must use this moment to recommit ourselves to finish the work. He told us to get out there and push and pull until we redeem the soul of America. As we confront our turbulent past, a pernicious disease, vast economic hardship and inequality, the ancient evil of racial injustice, the loss of John Lewis feels even more devastating and leaves many searching for answers. But John Lewis has already pointed the way. There's still work left to be done, he said. Finish the work. Get out there. Push and pull until we redeem the soul of America. May he forever rest in peace. Now on another matter. It's rare we gather at the start of a work session with so much to do in so little time. As we speak, our country faces the greatest public health crisis since 1918 and the greatest economic challenge since the Great Depression. Earlier this year, COVID exploded through the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest before finally subsiding. The economic pain of those first few months, over 40 million newly unemployed, was incomprehensible. Now states throughout the South and West are experiencing a similar surge in cases, hospitalization, and sadly deaths as the economic pain deepens. While all of us have watched in horror as this crisis unfolds, Senate Democrats have repeatedly called for action on crucial issues, like aid for state, local, and tribal governments, hazard pay for essential workers, funding for coronavirus testing and tracing, rental assistance, support for our nation's child care and education systems. Each time we sought to pass legislation on these issues, Senate Republicans blocked our attempts. Senate Republicans said that we should, in the words of Leader McConnell, quote, hit the pause button. Our Republican friends said they wanted to, quote, assess the conditions in the country, unquote, before providing any more relief. Our House colleagues passed the HEROES Act over 60 days ago. It's been well over 3 months, 3 long months, since we passed the CARES Act. And what has happened in those 3 months? 3 months ago, on April 20th, the United States reported 775 total cases of COVID-19 with 42,000 deaths. Today, we have nearly 3.8 million confirmed cases and 140,000 deaths. Just over 3 months ago, 30 million Americans had filed unemployment claims, and today that figure is nearly 50 million. More unemployment claims were filed in the last 17 weeks than in the entire 18-month stretch of the Great Recession. Today, the state of Florida has more infections per week than China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Australia, and the European Union combined. That is what has happened while Senate Republicans have been, quote, assessing the conditions in the country. That's what's been happening while Senate Republicans have hit the pause button. And now we know the real reason for Republican inaction, why they have hit the pause button. They can't come to agreement among themselves. The nation is raging in crisis. The Republican Party has been paralyzed, stopping and blocking action that Democrats have sought to deal with the problem. We may never know the true cost of Republican inaction over these past 3 months, but we know the time for waiting is over. We must consider another major COVID relief package this work period. Enhanced unemployment benefits expire at the end of the month. Protections against evictions expire this week. And schools are preparing for the fall without the necessary guidance and resources to open safely. The country is crying out for relief. The needless delays, the partisan politics, the infighting between the President and Senate and House Republicans has got to stop. But it seems that Leader McConnell has still not received that message. The Republican leader has said he's writing the next bill behind the closed doors of his office, and he will present it to his party first before dropping it on the Senate's lap. This one-party approach is the same approach that delayed the passage of the CARES Act, delayed the passage of the subsequent emergency relief legislation, utterly failed on policing reform, where the Republican bill was opposed by 136 civil rights organizations. For Leader McConnell to then get up and talk about that bill when the people were marching for a much stronger bill, the Justice in Policing Act, when civil rights organizations were urging that we not move forward on that bill, is twisting history in a way that no one is going to believe, and history will never accept. Each time Congress passed COVID relief, all 4 times, we did it by coming together in a bipartisan fashion between our 2 parties, between our 2 chambers. Leader McConnell 3 times tried to force a partisan bill down the Senate's throat, and it backfired every time. Leader McConnell, it won't work this time either. Leader McConnell called for my bipartisanship this morning. That's great. But Leader McConnell, sitting in your own office, writing a bill and demanding the other side support it is not anyone's idea of bipartisanship. And even worse, it appears that the Republican proposal is unlikely to meet the moment. From what we understand from press reports, McConnell's bill will prioritize corporate special interests over workers and Main Street businesses. It will fail to inadequately address the worsening spread of the virus. There are currently between 20 and 30 million unemployed Americans, and from all accounts, the Republican bill will not do nearly enough for them. As Americans struggle to keep up with the rent, we're facing an avalanche of evictions. From all accounts, the Republican bill will not address that. According to reports, the Republican bill will come up short on hazard pay for essential workers, aid to state and local and tribal governments, investments in communities of color ravaged by the virus. If the reports are accurate, the Republican bill will not come close, not even come close, to meeting the moment of this great crisis. The truth is, we have a good product to start with, the HEROES Act. It's already passed the House, and by the way, Leader McConnell, we need the House to make a law. And unlike the bill Leader McConnell is preparing, it actually matches the scale of the crisis and will put workers and small businesses and our health needs before special interests. Just to give you an example of where Republican priorities are right now, late last week it was reported the Trump administration wants to block tens of billions of dollars in the next COVID bill for states to conduct testing and contact tracing. Let me repeat that. When every expert says our lack of testing and contact tracing has led to the crisis being much greater in the U.S. than in most other countries, Trump wants to block that money for testing, for contact tracing. And if past his prologue, our Republican colleagues, so afraid of defending Donald Trump, even when they know he's wrong, will let him win the day, or at least greatly whittle down the needs that we have on tracing and testing. This report came days after we heard the administration ordered hospitals to stop reporting COVID data to the CDC and instead report them to state health departments or other portals more easily controlled by the White House. If there was ever positive proof that the president's more worried about his image and political interests than the health and safety of the American people, this is it: hiding data from the Centers for Disease Control. It's hard to believe. This man is not a leader. You can't hide from the truth. The coronavirus will continue to ravage us, whether the reports are public or not. But if the reports are public, we will all know more what to do. Has not President Trump learned? Have not the Republican senators learned that hiding from the truth just makes things worse? That's why so much of the blame, according to the American people, for what has happened falls on the shoulders of the president and the Republican senators who follow him blindly and obediently. It's hardly, and this unfortunately is hardly the only example of the president's abject failure to lead our nation through this awful crisis. I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.